Hi everybody. Today we're going to be focusing on using sources effectively. Let me get to the slide. There we go. Okay, so you can see it full screen. Okay, this is just going to be a pretty quick video about using sources effectively in MLA formatting. You'll primarily be using this in the research argument, which you should hopefully have started working on by now. And it's just kind of building off stuff that we talked about with the annotated bibliography. But we're just going to get right into it here. Okay. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about first about how to do in-text citations. These are also sometimes called parenthetical citations, but it basically means they're interchangeable. They're both the same thing. So just if you hear that, you know what we're talking about. Okay, second, there's three types of ways to incorporate outside information into your paper, and we're going to be spending some time with that. And then last, how to avoid plagiarism. Okay, first, so what are in-text citations? So with your annotated bibliography, your last project, you did the works cited entries. And what those do is those just kind of give your reader a little bit more information at the end of your paper to go and see your research and see what you looked at. And maybe if they want to go read that information, you can find it. In-text citations basically tell the reader from which outside source your information came from. And just like the works cited entry, it kind of depends on what type of information or what type of source it is, what kind of information you need to put in the parentheses. And I say the parentheses because most of the information goes in parentheses at the end of your quote or your paraphrase and all that. I'm going to show you examples here in a second. Okay, if it's a print source, you need the author's last name. If that's not listed in like the signaling phrase or the lead-in statement, which we're going to talk about that in a second too. And you also need the page number. If it's an electronic source, you need the author's last name if it's available, or if that's not available, you need to use a shortened title of the source. Now notice here, there is no page number, no paragraph number, nothing like that. And the reason is with electronic sources, okay, say you find an article online and you go to print it out. Well, if somebody else printed it out, depending on the formatting and their printer and all those kind of things, it might look differently. They might break up the paragraphs differently. So you don't need a page number with that at all. And then one last thing here, in-text citations always need some sort of signaling phrase showing the reader that you're going into a source, so you're going to use an outside information. They can include the author's name if that's available, and it should always include the source title. I'm going to show you a couple examples here on this next slide. Okay, for print sources in text, I've given you an example, and all the examples that I'm providing from you are from your reading for this week, so you can kind of keep that in mind too. This first one, I've bolded what the signaling phrase is or the lead-in phrase. Now you'll notice these are these are the writer's own words. So pretend you're writing this paper, everything in bold is your own words, and then the stuff that's in the quotes, all of that is from your outside source. So in this first example, in The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference, author Malcolm Gladwell defines the power of context, arguing that, and then it goes into the quote. So the author's name is listed in the lead-in statement. So if you look at the very end where it says 168 in the parentheses, that's going to be the page number. So if you put the author's name in the lead-in statement, you don't need it in the page number. However, or you can do it the second way. And so I've changed the lead-in statement, taking out the author's name, still the same quote here, and then it says Gladwell 168. The Gladwell is the author's last name. So either way is fine. You can do either one. I would always suggest changing it for your within your own paper, because then it gets a little repetitious if you use it the same way other way. But the main thing is either way is fine. You just need to have that information attributed to the author in some way. Okay, let's go on over here. For electronic sources in text. Now, I want you to take a second and note the example that I've given you here. Now, on this first example, you notice that there is no lead-in statement. That is because this is actually a paraphrase. Whereas the first one was a quote, this one's a paraphrase. I wanted to show you a couple examples in the video as well. So we got the example here of the information, and then in the parentheses it says, in quotes, it says national. That's a shortened version of the title. So that's totally acceptable because we don't have an author here. Or you could do it this way. Now you see the bolded here. I've bolded who wrote this idea, or who the short, or actually given the title here, according to the National Dropout Prevention Center /network, and then I use the same information. Again, either way is fine. With the quotes and the paraphrases, you don't necessarily need a lead-in statement because you are already putting it in your own words, but you can have one too. Either way is fine with that. Okay, the main thing that you need to think about here is you just need to be consistent, and you need to be sure that whatever you have in your parentheses or in your lead-in statement corresponds to the stuff at the end of the works cited page. Now, again, thinking back to your annotated bibliography, how you formatted those works cited entries, you're just going to do the same process with if you find new sources. Or if you don't have new sources, if you only use the sources in your annotated bibliography, you just need to copy and paste your works cited entries from your annotated bib onto the end of your research paper. But if you do have new sources, you need to create a new works cited entry for them. Okay, does that make sense? If you have questions about that, let me know. But again, here I've shown you in the example, we've got the end text, and then you've got underneath it, we have the works cited entry. So it just says Gladwell Malcolm. So all of this corresponds. All of it matches. I can say, oh, okay, she or he got this quote from this thing, and then I can go back and look at the works cited entry and see that they match. Okay, I want to talk just a second about plagiarism, and I'm sure you've all kind of heard this word, maybe even have read stuff about it. There are varying levels of plagiarism, but it should all be avoided at all costs. Obviously, like the more like obvious plagiarism would be if you just go online and buy a paper, or you go online and copy and paste an entire article and turn that in as your research paper. You're presenting your work as that it's yours when it's really not. That's probably the worst form of plagiarism. But then it all goes all the way down to, oh, I forgot a works cited entry, or oh, I forgot a works cited page, or something like that. Obviously, those last two are not intentional. You just forgot to put something in. And that's just something that it doesn't really work for this class. You need to be sure and get all that stuff in. And also it helps build your credibility if you make sure and have all the information. Okay, so things you can do to avoid plagiarism. The first thing is to start your work early. Start working, start typing your paper now. Trust me on this. Probably the main reason when I do catch people plagiarizing, which I don't like, so please don't do that. But when I do catch people plagiarizing, I said, what happened here? Tell me about what happened with this paper. And the number one thing they always say is, well, I guess I just ran out of time, or I put it off, or I procrastinated, or something along that line. Start your work early. Get it done, and be consistent in working on it, and you will thank yourself later. Because it really makes a really big difference. People get overwhelmed. They just think, oh, I can't do this. And then they go online and find stuff and just slop it down on paper, and it just really doesn't work. So don't do that. Second thing, compare your phrasing of information with that of the original source. Something I find kind of helpful is to keep either like a photocopy or just a printout of whatever I cited, and then I highlight or underline or something what I actually took from the source, like what I cited in my paper. And if it's a paraphrase or summary, I just kind of compare the two and see, okay, how different is mine? Okay, hopefully it's really different. And then if it's a quote, I just be sure that I put like the parentheses, I'd be sure and put the works cited stuff in, or in the in-text citation in. And also, if you're using a quote, especially if it's something from an online source you've just like cut and pasted, be sure to cite it as you're writing, or like leave a very bold note that says like, hey, go back and put your works cited or your in-text citation here. Because if you just kind of do it and then you don't really go back and check it, you're going to forget your in-text citation for that. It's totally fine to cut and paste a direct quote. I mean, obviously don't cut and paste your entire paper. I think that goes without saying. But if you just cut and paste a quote, be sure you cite it as you're writing it. Okay. always, last thing you want to do before you turn something in, just make sure you got a works cited page. That's just a really quick, easy little check to do. And if in doubt, don't ever be embarrassed. Just ask. It's kind of confusing the first few times that you use MLA works cited stuff. It can be really confusing, and it's a lot of information to keep straight. But don't be afraid. Just ask. I'm here to help you with that. Oh, and up here at the top of the slide, you see 378 to 385. Those are the corresponding page numbers in the Prentice Hall Reference Guide, so you can also read more about that there. Okay, we got 3 ways to incorporate your information in your paper. Again, corresponding page numbers are at the top. That's 386 to 396 here. The first way that you can put information in your paper is by summarizing that outside information. Now, obviously, that with that one, you use your own words and you highlight the main points of an entire work. We also have paraphrasing. Again, this uses your own words and it focuses on part of a work. The main difference between these two, they're very, very similar. The main difference is with summarizing, you're focusing on all the main points of what the author is saying. Think about the beginning of the word. Summarizing, it's just sum, S-U-M. When you hear the word sum, it's usually in math class. It's the total of 2 things you get added together. Think of this as the summarizing is focusing on the entire or the total work, whereas paraphrasing really only focuses on one part of the work, one specific piece of it. So that's how you can kind of keep those two straight. But again, they're very similar because you use your own words. Now, on the opposite side of things, we have a direct quote, which uses the author's words exactly and states the information exactly as the author wrote it. It's verbatim. With the direct quote, you always need to have that lead-in statement. With the paraphrasing and summarizing, you don't necessarily need to because you're using your own words to explain the idea. But the main thing to keep in mind is all 3 require an in-text citation and works cited entry. Even if it's your own words with the summarizing and the paraphrasing, you have to be sure and include a works cited entry and an in-text citation because the idea was not your own or the work necessarily wasn't your own. So kind of keep that in mind whenever you're doing them. Usually pretty strong papers use some combination of the 3. They don't just use all summaries or all paraphrases or all direct quotes. I want to talk a little bit more about quoting in depth a little bit there. First, be wary of overusing quotes. Be cautious about that. It can make it seem like you actually didn't write that much of your paper because all of it is somebody else's words. And it makes it seem what I like to call the quilted paper, because if you think about a quilt, you've got pieces of fabric and they're kind of stitched together and they're all mismatched up. That's kind of the same thing here. Quilted papers will have quote and then like one sentence of my own words and then quote and then one sentence of my own words. And you can kind of see how that would become problematic. One other thing to consider is if your quote is longer than 4 lines of text, it should be in what's called a block quote. What you'll need to do is omit the quotation marks and indent the entire quote over one space. Like when you indent it over to start a new paragraph, it should be the whole quote. So it's kind of set aside from the rest of the text. There's a really excellent example on page 393 of the Prentice Hall Reference Guide, so you can see more. You can see an example of what that is there. You still have the in-text citation, the information there, but you just don't have the quotation marks. I know it's a little confusing. One thing to also consider in your research paper, it's 4 to 6 pages in length. You shouldn't have probably more than 1, maybe 2 block quotes in the paper. Anything more than that is excessive, and you need to trim them to be down to under 4 lines. Oh, and one other thing, it's 4 lines of text, not 4 sentences. You can have 4 really short sentences, and that's fine. But if you have more than 4 lines of text. Again, I said this earlier, but always be sure to use signal phrases with quotes just because you're going into something that someone else said. So just be sure to do that there. Okay, last slide here. If you have questions, feel free to ask questions in the open forum or the email. And one last thing, if you're feeling frustrated, if this is your first time working with MLA citations or formatting, don't throw in the towel. It's confusing the first 2 times, but once you get used to it, it gets a lot easier. But again, any questions, feel free to use them post them in the open forum or shoot me an email. All right, have a great day, guys.